We're following breaking news on the tensions between Canada and the United States. U.S. President Donald Trump has abruptly reversed course on a new trade relationship between Canada and China. Trump had previously supported the recently signed deal, but now he's making fresh tariff threats over that very agreement.
A big change is coming, and most people do not see it yet. Carney is now part of a shift that could affect a key fertilizer the U.S. depends on to grow food. If that supply gets tighter, food prices could rise fast and families will feel it at the store. Potash is not a product most people think about it. Sits in the background of nearly every field of corn, wheat, soybeans, and vegetables grown in the United States. Without it, crop yields collapse with it, production scales to the volumes that make American food output what it is. The problem for American agriculture is structural and has been for decades. The United States does not have enough of it. The country maintains small domestic mining operations in Utah, New Mexico, Michigan. But industry experts have long noted these facilities produce lower quality ore and cannot come close to meeting national demand. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, Canada holds potash reserves nearly 5 times larger than those in the United States-Canada scale of potash mining by production volume is 36 times larger than American output. The supply dependency is not a recent development or a consequence of trade policy. It is a function of geology. Canada supplied approximately 85% of U.S. potash imports in 2024. According to the Fertilizer Institute, which represents the American fertilizer industry, that figure rises to nearly 90% by other industry measurements, depending on how import volumes are calculated across different time periods. The alternative suppliers, Belarus and Russia, are not considered viable options given the geopolitical circumstances that have defined both countries' international trade relationships. Since 2022, Canada does not compete for this market. It occupies it by default because the deposits exist in Saskatchewan and nowhere else accessible to American buyers at comparable cost and scale. The numbers underlying that dominance are significant. Canada accounted for more than 32% of global potash production in 2023 and over 41% of global exports. That year, Saskatchewan 11 active mines produced an estimated 21.9 million metric tons of potash in 2023. Nutrien, the world's largest single potash producer and exporter, owns 6 of those active Saskatchewan mines and sold more than 14.4 million metric tons of potash in 2024 alone, delivering to more than 40 countries. Canada total potash reserves stand at approximately 1.1 billion tons in potassium oxide equivalent, according to Natural Resources Canada. The tariff sequence that has introduced acute cost pressure into this supply relationship began in February 2025, when the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian fertilizer imports. American farm groups and industry associations pushed back immediately. The rate was subsequently reduced to 10% following that pressure. But even at 10%, the pass-through cost across a supply chain this large is not abstract. Potash prices were sitting around $450 per ton. According to Illinois Production Cost Report figures from early 2025, a full pass-through of a 25% tariff would add more than $100 per ton to supply sourced from Canada at 10%. The addition is smaller, but still compounds across the volumes American farmers require for a single planting season. Josh Linville, Vice President of Fertilizer at StoneX, described the supply dynamic precisely unlike some other tariffed goods, where the exporting country absorbs part of the cost increase. Potash exports operate differently. Canada holds the leverage in this supply relationship because domestic U.S. production cannot fill the gap. The structure is not subject to negotiation. On the American side, there are no alternative suppliers at scale, no domestic mines ready to expand production quickly, and no substitute input that agronomists have identified as a functional replacement for potash in high-yield crop production. Bob Thompson, president of the Michigan Farmers Union, stated, "The farm-level consequence directly any added costs from tariffs are passed down to individual farmers, and farmers have no mechanism to recover those costs because crop prices set by markets, not by producers." Bill Knudsen, a professor at the Michigan State Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics, said that tariffs push potash prices up and farm profits down, noting that virtually every major crop uses potash in some form. U.S. agriculture was already entering the 2025 and 2026 seasons with declining farm income, particularly for field crop producers facing the third consecutive year of depressed corn prices. Corn farmers are operating with severely compressed margins. Fertilizer represents 45% of operating expenses for U.S. corn farmers specifically, and between 30% and 45% of annual operating costs farmers across commodity categories when the single largest cost input becomes more expensive through a policy mechanism rather than through market supply and demand, the adjustment is absorbed entirely at the farm level. The U.S. import price index for chemical fertilizers rose from 164.5 in December 2024 to 186.5 in September 2025. That 14-month increase was not driven by global supply shortages or weather events. It was driven by the tariff structure applied to the country primary external supplier of a product the domestic industry cannot replace. The Fertilizer Institute has formally urged administration to grant exemptions for Canadian potash, specifically characterizing it as critical to U.S. agriculture. Nutrien itself warned that any new tariff increases would raise costs for American farmers with no compensating supply alternative available in the short or medium term. In December 2025, Trump indicated he was considering imposing severe new tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports as part of a broader strategy to incentivize domestic U.S. fertilizer production. The United States Department of Agriculture announced a plan to reshore fertilizer manufacturing industry. Groups responded that supply risks remain substantial, regardless of domestic production targets, because the infrastructure timeline for new potash mines does not align with the agricultural calendar. A proposed potash mine in Osceola County, Michigan, represents the most concrete near-term option for expanding U.S. domestic production. It could eventually produce 800,000 tons of potash per year. It depends on a $1.1 billion federal loan that received conditional approval in January 2025. Even if that financing is finalized and construction proceeds without delay, new mines require many years of development before reaching production capacity, capable of meaningfully reducing import dependence. The gap between policy ambition and operational reality in potash mining is measured in years, not months. Joe Jansen, an agricultural economist at the University of Illinois, added the structural counterargument to the domestic production strategy. Any expansion of U.S. fertilizer output driven by tariff protection would mean producers are being shielded from cheaper foreign competition. For farmers buying that domestically produced potash, the price advantage of Canadian supply disappears and is replaced by domestically priced product at a premium. The farmer pays more regardless of whether the potash came from Saskatchewan or Michigan. The tariff does not reduce the farmer cost. It shifts who captures the margin. While this pressure has been building inside American agriculture, Canadian potash producers have been accelerating their global expansion. BHP Jansen project in Saskatchewan begins production in 2026, adding significant new supply capacity to a Canadian industry that already dominates global export volumes. That new capacity is being positioned toward global markets, Europe, Asia, South America, rather than exclusively toward the United States. The diversification of Canadian potash export destinations, accelerated by the trade friction of the past year, means that Canada agricultural leverage is being built outward, even as American farmers remain structurally dependent on Canadian supply, with no credible domestic alternative ready to absorb the gap. The spring planting calendar does not pause for trade negotiations. Farmers commit to fertilizer purchases months before seeds go into the ground, locking in costs at whatever price the market reflects at the time of purchase. The decisions being made in Ottawa and Washington about potash tariff structures are translating directly into the cost calculations of corn and soybean producers in Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. Not next year, not in the next trade agreement cycle, but in the current planting season.